unaccustomed as I am to public speaking. Right. Okay. I'm going to pick up precisely where Evelyn left off because I want to do for you something different than I've done in the past 4 days, which has basically been to lead right up front with certain data from a collapsed rural area in Florida, which indicates that there are environmental factors which are very important in the transmission of AIDS. But I have more time. I don't have a format of 5 minutes or 15 minutes. So I want to give you a grasp of the fact that the universe is lawful, that there is causality in the universe, that the results of things you do are not a statistical accident. Now, Evelyn referenced the 1973-74 study. I was not around at the time of that study. I have reviewed the study. Subsequent to that study, at a time when I had become associated with the task force, there was an outbreak of cholera in Africa, 1984-85. It's still ongoing. And this was one of the things that we had, in fact, predicted. Now, it's an interesting prediction, and I want to discuss cholera just briefly for a second. There have been about 7 cholera pandemics which have gone around the world prior to the present situation. And all of these always originated in the same place, which was actually in India. But we predicted that the next major outbreak would originate in Africa. And we predicted that, and I reviewed the data, on the basis of an assessment of certain policies by the international lending agencies. This was the designation of most of the African subcontinent below the Sahara, the northern part of Brazil, a number of other areas, as the Fourth World. In other words, Mr. McNamara, who became president of the World Bank after having led us so gloriously through the Vietnam War and the seizure of the Pueblo, for those of you who are old enough to remember, and so forth, was rewarded with a chance to screw up the entire world instead of just one small subcontinent. So they gave him the presidency of the World Bank. And he said, well, these areas are a write-off. They are so poor and so desolate, they can't even be called the Third World. This is the Fourth World, and we're not going to do anything in these areas because it's a waste of money. We'll strip what we can out of them, but there will be no investment in these areas in terms of infrastructure of any sort. So we said, well, yeah, but if you do that, you are basically condemning hundreds of millions of people and entire subcontinents to death. And not only death of the people, but death of the very physical environment. Because if you don't have irrigation projects in areas which need water, then there is a natural process called desertification, which you see happening in Africa now, where the Sahara Desert is expanding, and where formerly green areas are now desert. Because if you don't grow crops, then water doesn't evaporate from the crops, then you don't get rain, the area dries out and this spreads. So we said if this happens, we predict certain consequences based on numerous historical examples of similar policies and processes. We predicted a series of outbreaks of famine and disease. We predicted the famine in Africa. We predicted it that it would happen back in the 70s when we came out with this material. The relevant people at the Food and Agriculture Organization, World Health Organization, and so forth said that our predictions were nonsense. And yet there is desertification and famine in precisely the areas we predicted. And the people who disclaimed this knew that we were right. However, they had determined to implement these policies, at least in part because they believed that there were too many people, and that there were certainly too many black, brown, and yellow people. So these things have come about. We said that if you did this, you would have this population, hundreds of millions of malnourished people, living together in crowded, unsanitary conditions, or else out at barely above the level of animals out in the jungle. That you would have a population which was immune depressed. Immune depressed as a result of the most common cause of immune depression in the world, which is not AIDS per se, it's malnutrition. If you actually look at the number of people affected by malnutrition, and you look for the number of people affected by immune deficiency, you are talking about the same population. It is the most common cause of immune deficiency. However, given that large immune-suppressed population, you then had a literal culture medium in which organisms which normally would not infect human beings and cause disease would do so. And that once these organisms, some of which were normal, harmless scavenger-type organisms in the environment, some of which were organisms which were pathologic for animals but not for man, once these organisms gained a hold in that population and began to grow in that population, that they would acquire increased ability to infect people who weren't even as immune depressed as the target population, and that you would then have new human diseases evolving as a direct consequence of monetary policy. Now, we could go back in history to the time of the Emperor Justinian in the 6th century. Justinian initiated a series of, quote, reforms, which were basically the reimposition of the worst features of the old Roman pagan state, and an economic policy which is indistinguishable from Graham-Rudman. And we had the Justinian plague. This was an outbreak of plague which swept across Europe and parts of Asia and so forth and killed 100 million people in the 6th century. So old Justinian was no piker. He knew how to do it. A similar policy was followed by the Lombard bankers of Italy in the 14th century. The rate of taxation and debt service on the feudal economy was so great that not enough of the produce of that economy could be fed back in to nourish the population. And so an interesting thing happened. In the year 1300, the population of the city of Florence was 107,000 people. In the year 1347, the population of the city of Florence was 79,000 people. In the year 1348, the plague hit. So even before the outbreak of the plague, there had been significant depopulation of Europe through starvation, malnutrition, and so forth, and other diseases. And it was that weakened and already declining population which was then hit by the plague, which ultimately resulted in reducing the population of Europe in half. But throughout history, plagues of this sort have never hit expanding populations. They hit declining populations. And no one can cite a single historical instance of any society or civilization which improved its economic situation by reducing or stabilizing its population. Just as if you look through history, at every time austerity economic policies were introduced and were maintained over time, the result was a collapse of society in epidemics of war and disease. This has been the invariable result every time the policies represented by the Gramm-Rudman Amendment and by the International Monetary Fund conditionalities in general have been applied. There's not a single historical instance of any society which actually rebuilt its economy with austerity. It has never happened. It never will happen. And there are reasons for it. But what has happened in those cases in which societies have not collapsed is that a mobilization, usually on the necessity of fighting a war, has revitalized the economy. And it is only these mobilizations of economy which in fact can reverse the conditions of collapse in a society. If you reduce the capacity of a society to sustain a given number of individuals, then not only will the individuals in excess of that number die, but many more along with them, because collapses never happen smoothly. And they never stop where they're planned to stop. They keep going. At the end of World War I, 3 or 4 million people had been killed on the battlefields of Europe over a period of 4 years. In 6 months, after the war ended, in 1918, influenza swept 50 million people off the face of this earth.
Including 3 in my family.
Yeah, okay. Why did it happen? Because this was not the first time we had influenza. There had been previous epidemics of influenza in the 1800s. Why in 1918 did the Spanish flu kill 50 million people? Well, it was very simple. What was the state of the world's economy and the physical environment at that period of time? It had been totally devastated by 4 years of trench war in Europe. There's widespread malnutrition, starvation, sanitary systems had been destroyed, water supplies were contaminated. It was on this population that the visitation of the Spanish flu produced 50 million deaths. Now, the United States was not physically involved in World War I in the sense of having action on its territory. So the state of sanitation and of nutrition was relatively better in the United States. So in the United States, only about 500,000 people died. The remaining 49.5 million died in those areas which had been totally devastated. Now, if you look at the environmental situation in the world today, you see a desert expanding in Africa. You see widespread famine, which we predicted, etc., etc. You see the outbreak of cholera in Africa, which we again predicted. You see a huge area of northern Brazil in which the infant mortality rates are 50%. Half of the children die shortly after birth. An area where a couple of years ago, in order to service the Brazilian debt, the farmers of northern Brazil were compelled by the International Monetary Fund to sell their corn crop at $2 a bushel, which they did. And then, in order to feed the people in northern Brazil, or attempt to, they were compelled to pay $4 a bushel to buy some of it back. All right? This is what is happening. It is not coincidental that Dr. Veronese from Sao Paulo wrote an article, which we published in EIR, predicting that the second largest number of cases of AIDS in the world would be in Brazil. And the evidence is beginning to bear him out. Although this is officially reported cases, by far the largest number in Africa. And this is the important thing about AIDS. AIDS is a disease of environmental and sanitary collapse. If you subtract the homosexual cases in the United States and Western Europe which probably represent less than 5% of the real total number of cases in the world, what are you looking at? You are looking at a disease of poor people, mostly black and Hispanic, living under conditions of incredible poverty and totally destroyed sanitation, and geographically localized to an area which would be designated as the mosquito virus belt, i.e. that area of the world in which insect-transmitted virus diseases are endemic. And that is the Atlantic and Gulf coastal regions of the United States, the Caribbean, sub-Saharan Africa. The same belt which was described as the AIDS belt in Africa is the yellow fever belt in Africa, is the area where sleeping sickness is spreading in Africa. All of these are insect-vectored diseases. So, there is a fundamental law of biology which says that the waste products of any organism are toxic to that organism, and that you could fairly well describe civilization as that form of social organization which, among other things, separates what we eat from what we excrete. And that if you wanted to look at the number of lives saved up until the present century, then many, many orders more people are alive because of sewers than because of physicians. That water sanitation and food sanitation, proper waste disposal, are the absolute essentials of civilization. Because it is only when you have secured these things that you have created the environmental conditions in which the majority of your population will not die of infectious diseases before the age of 20. And it is only when you have that sort of situation that you can have civilization. So, what is the relevance of all of this? Well, let's look at the United States today, let's look at Africa, let's look at South America. The biggest central issue in Africa is water. Similarly in South America, for many, many reasons. Water for irrigation to grow food, clean water to drink, proper water maintenance to prevent the growth of insect vectors. Malaria, mosquitoes, where do they breed? They breed in stagnant water. Schistosomiasis, one of the leading causes of illness in the world today, snail fever, breeds in stagnant water. So, this is what is happening. Now let's look at the United States. McKeesport, Pennsylvania. Some people may have heard of McKeesport. It used to have the largest tube steel plant in the world. It is a city in which the steel industry has been collapsed and shut down. It's already gone the way which the oil industry in California is presently going. And it has dysentery. You don't have to go down to Mexico to get Montezuma's revenge anymore. You can go to any of a number of formerly industrialized northeastern and north central cities in the United States and get it there. Because the sewer systems have broken down, the water processing systems have broken down, and you have fecal contamination of the water supply. You look at the Graham-Rudman Amendment, you look at where the cuts hit. Where are they hitting? Water and sewer projects are going to be cut. My colleague Webster Tarpley, who's running for the Senate in New York, actually was thinking of using the slogan that Graham-Rudman makes you eat shit. But in a very literal sense, it's true. And it is not healthy to do it. Now, what is the specific situation I referenced in Florida? Well, we have a number of depressed agricultural communities in southern Florida. One of these is a little town called Belglade. It has a population of 20,000 people. A significant portion of this population are migrant workers, many of whom live in a 10-square block area. In this 10-square block area of Belglade, there are over 100 AIDS cases at the present moment. It's not bad for a population of 20,000. It's the highest rate in the United States and possibly in the world. Over 70 cases of active tuberculosis in the same area. The rest of Belglade, risk is apparently the same as anywhere else. So it is all concentrated in this area. Area characterized by mosquito breeding, rat infestation, and open sewage. No ventilation in the houses, overcrowding, the whole business. The average resident of this community is bitten 100 to 150 times a day by insects and other biting, mosquitoes and other biting insects. The majority of these AIDS cases are not homosexual, are not IV drug users, are not hemophiliacs, are not sexually promiscuous, have not received blood transfusions. All of them have been exposed to one or more insect-transmitted viruses. They develop a very fulminant form of AIDS. The majority of them are dead within 2 years of developing the symptoms. A great many of them die with tuberculosis or with a parasite called toxoplasmosis. This is the pattern of African AIDS. This is the pattern of Caribbean AIDS. People living under abysmal environmental conditions, being multiply infected by contaminated water, by multiple insect bites, relatively poor nutrition. And these people develop this disease and they die from it. 3 weeks ago, in the space of 1 week, 10 people died of AIDS in Belglade, Florida. All right? It's not the only case. Delray Beach, a few other communities, one on the west coast now of Florida, communities in southern Texas. You look at these areas, and these are the areas where the mosquitoes breed year-round. Now, the response of this, to this, on the part of the Centers for Disease Control, has been, number one, to lie about the data and insist that all of the patients are in risk groups. Well, it's not true. Certainly the physicians who are actually on the scene, who have been in Belglade every 2 weeks for the past 2.5 years, and who know not only the patients, but the patients' families, and the patients' friends, and the patients' enemies, have a pretty good idea of what these patients do and don't do. Because even if their friends covered up for them, their enemies would squeal on them. All right? These are the same physicians, Dr. Whiteside and Dr. McLeod, who have gone out into Belglade, who have trapped the mosquitoes, who have actually looked at the sanitary conditioning of the housing and so forth. They say that this is what we have. The CDC, well, one member of the CDC AIDS task force rode through Belglade in a closed car, never opened the windows, never got out of the car, and went back to the CDC and basically makes the claims that, you know, these are all risk group patients. The gentleman whom the CDC placed in charge of setting up the surveillance program was a gentleman named Gus Sermos. Well, Gus got a little concerned about the fact that the state of Florida was spending all of the funds in the program in northern Florida to hire clerical help in Tallahassee, and none of the money, or very little of it, in southern Florida where all the AIDS cases were. He raised this issue with his superiors at CDC. They said, well, there's nothing we can do about it. We don't want to upset the state. You know, leave it alone. Dr. Whiteside and Dr. McLeod from the Institute of Tropical Medicine came out with the information about the no-risk cases in Belgrade. Mr. Sermos was told by the then Director of Health and Human Resources of the state of Florida, Dr. Whitty, to stay out of Belgrade and to keep his assistant, Mr. Witham, out of Belgrade. All right? Dr. Whitty, incidentally, formerly worked for the CDC. And CDC, when Mr. Sermos brought this situation to their attention, said, well, we don't know what it is, but it's not important. So, when Mr. Sermos persisted, he was finally relieved of his job. He was relieved of his job because he was upset about the fact that the CDC was violating all of their own procedure guides in the case of AIDS in Florida. That there was an active disinterest on the part of the Centers for Disease Control in acquiring this data. So Mr. Sermos gave us an interview. It was a rather long interview. Some of it was published in the newspaper. Some of it was published in Executive Intelligence Review. The part that was published in the newspapers was distributed in the CDC offices. It was handed out, put in every office door. There was a towering silence, and 48 hours later, a thing came out in the newspapers that the CDC was going to do a real study of the situation in Belgrade, right? Well, the only problem with that is that the CDC study basically consisted of the words, do you fornicate and with whom? Or have you ever sat next to a Haitian? That's another question. This is a direct question off the questionnaire. No questions about exposure to insects. No question about outside exposure in the field. No question about recreational activities such as fishing on canals where mosquitoes breed. Nothing. Nothing on the environment. It was a study which was premised on the belief that everything that was not risk group AIDS in Belgrade was the result of heterosexual sex, and all this study was designed to do was to confirm it. Do you fornicate? Yes. Therefore. That's how you got it. Now why? Why? Well, it's very simple. If the only way you can get AIDS is by being a homosexual, or a drug user, or promiscuous, then it's your own damn fault if you get it. And the only thing we can do is to educate you, to use condoms if you fornicate with men or women, and to use clean needles if you happen to be a junkie. See, and that's going to stop this thing. Well, the whole point of Belgrade is that the majority of these 100 patients with AIDS would have still gotten their AIDS even if they had used clean needles, because they're not drug addicts, so it wouldn't have made any difference. Even if they had used condoms, because they didn't get it that way. And that's the whole point. But as long as you can blame the victims for it, you can absolve yourself of the responsibility of dealing with the conditions in which this disease arises. Now, that's all well and good. So this is the policy. This is an official policy which comes down from the Centers for Disease Control. It is handed out as official policy. A certain number of eminent people come forward and say, yes, this is good, so forth and so on. You have a certain political interest in the homosexual community who don't want the idea that this thing could become widespread into the general population, on one hand, because they think it will make them a target. On the other hand, as long as the administration believes that this disease mainly kills homosexuals and drug addicts, they're not going to put out a nickel more for it than they absolutely have to. So we have this very interesting situation. And in the meantime, the disease is spreading. Now, how is it spreading? Well, it's spreading by in the homosexual community. It is spreading very rapidly in the drug-abusing community. But we are also seeing it spread in other ways. Now, we have little reports here and little reports there. A mother becomes exposed to the virus by caring for her child. Her child got exposed to the virus because the child was a sick child and required multiple blood transfusions. As far as we know, the mother didn't sleep with the child sexually. She did take care of the child. The child was sick, and she now has it. Numerous other things. A number of sewer workers in Dade County, Florida, have come down with AIDS. They have no risk factor for AIDS, but they've got the disease. In the most recent New England Journal of Medicine, there's a report of antibodies to the AIDS virus in victims of malaria, again, with no risks. But they happen to have malaria, and lo and behold, they happen to have the AIDS virus along with it. Now, they didn't get their malaria by sexual intercourse, and I strongly suspect they didn't get their AIDS virus by it either. There is a large body of this sort of evidence. And yet, there is a systematic avoidance of this thing by the Centers for Disease Control. Why? Because if you understand the implications of AIDS as an environmental disease, then the blame no longer falls on the poor sucker who's got it. The blame falls, or the responsibility falls, on those people who are responsible for seeing that adequate levels of sanitation exist in a community, the public health officials. And I would say to you that in point of fact, this sort of selective myopia of public health officials who are operating under the current administration policy, this myopia which allows them to ignore all of this data, is probably the most potent vector spreading this disease today. Because conservatively, we've got 2 million people infected with the virus. Now, a year or so ago, everybody said, well, less than 1% of these people will actually develop disease. A few months later, well, less than 5% of these people will ultimately develop disease. A few months after that, it was 10. Current figures are that approximately 1/3 of people infected with this virus will come down with AIDS. Now, that's bad enough, because you're talking about 660,000 people, roughly, out of 2 million infected in the United States. But there's a problem. And the problem is that the AIDS virus is associated with things other than AIDS. One thing which those who had some idea of the biology of this virus strongly suspected is a progressive degenerative disease of the brain. And the best evidence now indicates that probably everybody who carries this virus would ultimately develop degenerative brain disease. Everybody. It might take 10 or 15 years to kill you, but it will. See, that's our problem. It's a long incubation virus. We haven't even gone through the median incubation period yet. So we are now seeing people develop primary degenerative brain disease who are infected with this virus and who never have had or presently have AIDS. And I would submit to you that what we are seeing are the first cases among those people who were infected back in 1978 to 80 are just now showing up. So we have a budget of $200 million to deal with this problem, the nation's #1 public health problem, which indeed it is. It is probably the human race's #1 public health problem in a very significant sense. But if you think about the fact that the cost of the first 7,000 cases was around $10 billion, that the average cost for treating an AIDS patient varies from anywhere from $60,000 to $140,000. So we could probably average it at $100,000. Try 100,000 times 2 million as a cost projection of the currently infected people, assuming no further transmission occurs over the next 5 years. And I would submit to you that the immediate expenditure of several $billion, both for surveillance and for the development of drugs which would prevent the virus from continuing to multiply, would save us one heck of a lot of money. But what we have is $200-some-odd million, a great deal of which is being spent on, quote, education. Education which is based upon a dangerously incomplete concept of how this disease spreads. What are the other bits of evidence? Well, immune depression. One sign of immune depression is activation of tuberculosis. We have tuberculosis coming back in the United States today. There are outbreaks of tuberculosis in New York City. There are outbreaks here in California. There are outbreaks in Florida, in Boston, and various central cities. And even the Centers for Disease Control had to admit in a publication on February 7th that probably the majority, if not all, of this resurgence of tuberculosis is AIDS-related tuberculosis. It's breaking out all over the place. And if you think about the fact that 2 billion people in the world have been infected by tuberculosis, if you dump the AIDS virus into that, you have a biological time bomb of somewhat awesome dimension. Because when several million people start coming down with active drug-resistant tuberculosis and start coughing that on everybody else, along with the AIDS virus, which does go into a respiratory phase, then you have the potential for some real fun. Case example, Eastern Shore of Maryland, shellfish processing plant. 3 workers in this plant come down with tuberculosis. Initial screening survey is done. 15 of 30 employees, active tuberculosis by skin test and chest x-ray. 6 months later, one of the 15 who tested negative dies of rapidly progressive tuberculosis. This woman developed tuberculosis and went on to death in less than 6 months. Drug-resistant tuberculosis. So they go back and they screen 80 workers who, as it turns out, were the ones put forward by the company as the healthiest looking. 30 of that 80 have active tuberculosis. Initial screening survey in the surrounding population. 20% of the sample, active tuberculosis by skin test and chest x-ray. Call up the Maryland Department of Health. Ask them if there's an outbreak of tuberculosis in Kent Narrows. And they'll probably tell you no. And they may hang the phone up on you. All right? So another colleague of mine goes out, has a press conference. She's a doctor of public health from Johns Hopkins, as it happens, and says all of these people should be tested for AIDS. Because the development of tuberculosis is a major marker for AIDS. Maryland public health authorities freak out. They hold a big meeting. And at this meeting, a whole bunch of epidemiologists and infectious disease specialists come forward and say, well, Dr. Deborah Freeman is scandal-mongering, and anybody who says there's any connection between AIDS and tuberculosis doesn't know what they're talking about. There is no such thing, and so forth. Well, Debbie showed up there. They didn't know what she looked like. So after this large amount of pontificating from the platform, Debbie stands up and she says, well, she said, do you people place any credence in the Centers for Disease Control? Oh, the Centers for Disease Control. You know, it's sort of like, you know, Moses got the tablets, right? Yes, it's the gospel. So fine. She stands up with the February 7th issue of the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report. This is a publication by the CDC, which basically summarizes all reportable disease cases. And she reads this article, which I told her about the relation of AIDS and tuberculosis. She reads from the gospel, right? They say, this is the gospel. She's unkind enough to read from the gospel. The director of the meeting gets very upset. He seizes the document from her hands. He rips it into little shreds and he says, you forged this. True. This is the reaction of public health authorities to an outbreak of drug-resistant tuberculosis. This sort of thing. This is what we have to fight. This is what you have to understand. This is a policy. This is an economic policy which has always produced death, will always produce death, is presently producing death, and yet everybody says, this is the policy. And reality, and people dropping dead in the streets of Belglade, Florida, or coughing up their what's left of their bloody lungs in Kent Narrows, Maryland, is not to stand in the way of policy. The same policy which is leading to deaths by the thousands and potentially millions in Africa, same policy which is tearing South America apart, the same policy which is making the people of McKeesport, Pennsylvania, drink shit, even if they don't eat it necessarily. This policy, this is what the fight is about. You must understand that. You must understand that you cannot destroy the standard of nutrition and the standard of sanitation of a population without facing the fact that you are going to destroy that population. When Paul Volcker gets up and says that the standard of living of the average American worker has to decline by 10% or 25%, what does that mean? It means that you will eat food which is less nutritious. It means that you will live in a dirtier neighborhood. It means that your water will be contaminated by your sewage. It means you will get sicker more often. You will die younger. And since death, according to some other great expert, is the ultimate medical economy, this is the way we're going to cut the Medicare bills, right? And yet, think about it. Think about the whole death with dignity thing. Think about the fact that we can't afford to feed these useless eaters because we have a recovery, folks. And in order to continue this recovery, you and your children have to drink sewage. You and your children have to eat poorer quality food than you did yesterday or the day before. You and your children have to watch while the general standard of sanitation in your community collapses. We are going to die from this recovery if it continues. And all that AIDS is one of the mechanisms by which that will happen. I want to do a little discussion of it because it's actually interesting. What is a virus? Well, all that a virus is a little group of genes packed in an envelope, which can be mailed from one cell to another, so to speak. And it turns out that probably all viruses ultimately originate from cells, from host cells, that they're not primary particles, and that there are genes within the human genome, the animal genome, and so forth, which are protoviruses. They are genetic sequences which have the potential to express themselves as viruses. Now, once they become viruses, they can then enter another cell. And in the case of the retroviruses, which is the AIDS virus, they have the interesting property of being able to transcribe themselves into DNA, which is then incorporated into that cell. and becomes part of the hereditary information of that cell. So you can inherit these viruses. They're called proviruses, or proviral sequences of the genome. And in point of fact, there is evidence that a number of the animal tumor viruses were inherited when they crossed the species barrier many million years ago. For instance, the virus that causes cat leukemia is actually a monkey virus, a primate virus, which infected the ancestor of the common house cat many aeons ago, and then was passed down as an inherited genetic sequence, which under the proper circumstances will express itself. But that even if you weren't infected by anything, that there are certain parts of your own genetic material which under stress will be expressed as viruses. So this is a very interesting thing, because what we are looking at perhaps is a mechanism by which Mother Nature, let's say, scavenges species which are no longer performing their function in the universe. And the function of man in the universe is to transform that universe to ever higher degrees of perfection. Well, maybe man has decided that he's tired of transforming the universe, that it's no longer his responsibility. Well, fine. Then, in a very fundamental sense, man is superfluous to the universe once he makes that decision, and is no longer necessary. And so there is a mechanism for dealing with that. If you believe that the death of a man is of no more importance to the universe than the death of an oyster, in other words, if you're David Hume or some other British empiricist faggot, then you will ultimately die of the consequences of that belief. Because the consequence of that belief is to renounce the purpose for which you are here, which is to do what no other species can do. So you have the unique distinction of belonging to the only animal species which is actually capable of increasing the capacity of the universe to support that species by its own activity. Dolphins may be intelligent, but I can assure you that they, by their action, will never increase the capacity of this earth to support more dolphins. And that the dolphin of tomorrow will live as his father before him and as his son after him. Men aren't like that. Or potentially they're not like that. If they are like that, they call them peasants. The person who lives the way his father and his grandfather and his grandfather's father and so forth before him lived, making no change, living at a fixed, static mode of existence. And societies that live that way ultimately collapse, because they always run up against the same finite resources story. Man has the God-given ability to transform his resource base. You ask yourself one simple question. Kushra will probably go into this in some detail, and I'm going to get off it in a few minutes, but just, what is a natural resource? Is mud a natural resource? Mud. Is mud a natural resource? Well, what the hell was petroleum before we developed petroleum technology? It was mud that was harder to wash off than normal. Right? Now people fight wars over it. Are rocks a natural resource? Well, if they happen to have uranium in them and you have nuclear technology, then they are a natural resource. And they are a resource which enables you to command much more powerful energy than before. But it also requires a much more sophisticated technology. But see, you've got a brain. And that brain enables you to understand the lawfulness of the universe and to act on that understanding to transform the laws of the universe to ever higher degrees of perfection. And in point of fact, you were put in the universe to do that. Look at the desert in Africa at the present time and ask yourself, how long will it take Mother Nature to green that desert? Maybe never. Eons, millennia. How long would it take you, or somebody who had a good command of construction engineering, to green that desert? My bet is 5 to 10 years at the most with an irrigation project. You have a unique role in the universe. Man is necessary to the universe because as the universe develops more rapidly, a greater capability of transformation is required in the universe. And that's what man represents. However, if you decide that we're going to stop where we are, then you become superfluous. And whether it's AIDS or it goes under any other name, the process by which a species which has renounced its responsibility is eliminated is, it's a matter of one mechanism or another. But you have to understand it in that sense. It's a very fundamental thing, but it's important. And this is the crux of the whole issue. This is what we're talking about. Sure, there's a disease out there. It's a very dangerous disease. It's a very, very dangerous disease because in order to really stop this disease, we are going to be compelled to do something which terrifies many people, which is to recognize that the universe is lawful and that one has to think. And that having thought as a human being and having the concept that the universe is lawful, one has to have the confidence to act upon that thought and not say, after looking at the situation and saying, well, this is a really horrendous situation, however, maybe it won't happen. Well, yeah, I know what you're saying is true and it makes sense, but it can't be that bad. There's got to be an out. Well, see, the problem with that is you can probably buy a politician. You can probably pay off the local mafioso not to knock over your store or something. But you can't buy off this disease. You can't cut a deal with it. You can't negotiate with it. See, it ain't going to listen. This thing is susceptible to only one thing, and that is reality. The only way this thing is going to be stopped is by addressing the economic collapse, the specific problems in sanitation and so forth, the consequences of the monetary policies which brought this thing into existence just as they brought the Justinian plague into existence and brought a great many people out of existence, just as they did it again in the 14th century. These policies, you must understand that these policies go way back, and the devastation wrought by these policies goes way back. But they are not inevitable. They are policies. And like all policies, they can be changed. However, changing them requires action on the part of people. Policies are made by people, policies are changed by people. And that is what your responsibility in this thing is. But that's why it is important for you to understand this sort of, shall we say, theoretical consideration in the issue. Because if you don't understand that, and if you don't understand the issue that's really involved, you're going to lose. You're going to lose. You're going to fall into the same American pragmatic syndrome that has lost us so much already. You're going to try and make a deal. You're going to be like the person who has an who produced the best possible arrangement of the deck chairs on the Titanic. And this is the whole point. When you are in a bus, and that bus is about to go over the side of a cliff, you are not serving the interest of the people on that bus by sitting down and telling everybody there's not a problem. Your duty in that situation is to grab the wheel and keep it from going off the cliff. And that's what we're talking about. And unless you understand that, the bus is going to go off the cliff, even if you've managed to keep everybody calm and they're all sitting in their seats when it goes. So I will open it up for questions now.